My name is Maggie. With me is Professor Park and Eugene. On the motion, this House believes that LGBTQ plus activists did not want individuals to use and advocate for LGBTQ rights and individuals using their local historical terms instead of Western terminology. I now invite Prime Minister to start the debate.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. What we recognize on the opening argument is that necessarily what local gay rights or local non-binary LGBTQ communities in certain countries want is not necessarily the same as what the LGBTQ movement in the West wants to achieve. Ladies and gentlemen, in this setting, we would say it is better that the movement itself follows and uses the correct terminologies of what precisely they're going to represent and what people on the ground and the supporters want. Because in the end, if you use Western terminologies, because of the power of words and language, what happens is that their movement is going to be hijacked, and the nuances and precious nuances involved in these terminologies are going to be lost. Ladies and gentlemen, what we say is that we have to actually keep with what the local community wants, and for that terminology is very important, and that's what we propose in this motion. Now, simply what we say is that local LGBTQ movements in Southeast Asia or other nations like that, ladies and gentlemen, shouldn't use LGBTQ as a description of the people they stand for. They should use instead the names of the communities, or for example, local languages which are associated with nuances that is represented in these words. And that's what we're going to say. Ladies and gentlemen, I have three arguments to make. Firstly, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to talk about what precisely it is that these nuanced words represent and what is the difference between the LGBTQ movement of the West and the local movements. And secondly, I'm going to talk about the practical outcome, how the process where this nuance is going to be lost and how is it irreversible. And lastly, I'm going to talk about why it is better that we actually go with them. And the movement itself has a mandate to follow this, what the people want and use the terminologies therefore. Now, firstly, what are the differences? Ladies and gentlemen, in West, ladies and gentlemen, what we say is that,
Right. For instance, Hijra in India are kind of worshipped in the local villages because they are regarded as special kinds of people. What are you talking about? Discrimination against them?
The thing is, we think that they are actually wanting, that's precisely the discrimination I'm going to actually answer. We think that there is a difference. Like in West, because of the Catholicism or other religious things, ladies and gentlemen, traditionally the LGBTQ movement people has been limited in terms of their representation and rights. And therefore, what they are pursuing is necessarily individualistic in the first place, and it's power-based, meaning that I shouldn't be discriminated, I should have more rights, I should be able to climb up the social ladder, I shouldn't be discriminated in terms of getting jobs and these kinds of things. Ladies and gentlemen, this is, we think, associated with the Western culture, especially capitalism, ladies and gentlemen, where it is important and the most important cultural consideration of rights is your economic rights and the rights of political participation and these kinds of things, ladies and gentlemen. That is why the movement itself is individualistic and it is power-based. In these kind of communities, what happens is that it is necessarily based on a tribal culture or a group culture in local settings. So what they want is not necessarily individually based, it is rather community based. it is a community of shared identity, and they share the identity of gayness, share the identity of being non-binary within that community, and they use it as a fact of mutual cooperation, and they want to be not like represented in the world, but rather be left alone, untouched by other people. That's what these local communities want. So it is completely different from in terms of the ideologies and the goals, and that is why we think that these things are different. We think similar trends can be seen in all kinds of Asian local communities. They necessarily don't want to, for example, in China, they don't necessarily want to learn the Han Chinese, the Han Mandarin Chinese, ladies and gentlemen. They want to stick with their own languages because they think it is about their culture, and they think they don't want to be left alone and uncontrolled from the authorities in Beijing, ladies and gentlemen. So that is the difference. So how it is that when we use the terminologies, this identity and the nuances involved in this is lost. First of all, we think that in terms of the number, what happens is that when you use the same terminologies, ladies and gentlemen, like Western activists are also associating themselves with the local movement, meaning that there would be more opportunities of cooperation, meaning that they would shaft in a lot of money and people, activists, ladies and gentlemen. They use this in media control, ladies and gentlemen, and actually promote the language of LGBTQ, which is not necessarily what people want. But secondly, ladies and gentlemen, word is very important, ladies and gentlemen. Word is what defines your culture, and it's very, very closely linked, ladies and gentlemen. There's a word in Japanese called miyabi. Miyabi is a term that can be translated in English in terms of elegance. Elegance, ladies and gentlemen, is a Western word that represents power and social status, ladies and gentlemen. Miyabi is more about being part of the nature and beautiful, ladies and gentlemen. These kind of, if you use the same different words, nuances might be lost. And that happens all across the world, ladies and gentlemen. We have destroyed a lot of words, of languages, and we have actually lost a lot of cultures, and this is very important. Ladies and gentlemen, the importance of this is that this cultural loss is actually irreversible, ladies and gentlemen, because if you use the same terminology as a Western powerful ones, it is difficult for individuals to choose to go back to their own terminologies, because one, it is going to be a minority, but it gives them more access, ladies and gentlemen, to more power and money. So the Western convenience that they receive is so powerful that they shift their mindset, and they will not really use their own languages altogether in the beginning. So why do we think these groups have a mandate to use local terminologies? First of all, the supporters of this movement are likely to be the local LGBTQ tribes and groups, ladies and gentlemen. So they have a duty to represent what they want, ladies and gentlemen, and that is going to be important. But secondly, ladies and gentlemen, we think the definitions of rights, ladies and gentlemen, of what it is important to advance rights. That is the goal of LGBTQ movements. We agree with that position. The thing is, the definition of rights can change from culture to culture. In the West, like I told you, economic rights has been seen as the most important. Therefore, they have advocated for rights of companies more to actually burn down their environment to have profit, and that's seen as a beautiful thing. In local rights, ladies and gentlemen, if you are in indigenous culture, ladies and gentlemen, it is culturally more important to go for the right of the preservation of the environment rather than actually getting more money. So the rights and the goals can be very different. Ladies and gentlemen, what we say is that the Western culture, the Western movement of the LGBT promotes the rights to do for you as an individual, to do whatever you want. These cultures are completely different, and it is important, therefore, to preserve the terminologies, because terminology and language is defining what the culture is. Ladies and gentlemen, we beg to propose. Thank you.
So the major assumption coming from opening government is that they're worried about cultural losses. they're worried that these minorities within these non-Western countries will suddenly lose all of their positions within society and not be recognized within their culture or whatnot, right? However, we don't think that these kind of minorities that they're depicting are not mutually exclusive to our side, because we think that these kind of minorities that they're trying to depict in their case will still be respected on our side of the house, right? Because we're talking about LGBTQ movements right now, right? When we talk about LGBTQ movements and also these kind of local historical terms, we think that local historical terms have a different focal point with these kind of LGBTQ plus terms, right? Because the reason being is that we think that these kind of local historical terms have different or unique historical backgrounds. We think that first of all, these kind of minorities, or that these local historical terms depict are not really dominant, do not really share a common ground with these kind of LGBTQ terms, because they have unique historical backgrounds, unique cultural backgrounds, and there are a lot of domestic influences that have been embedded in these kind of local historical terms. We don't think that they accurately depict the LGBTQ rights in the status quo. Secondly, we don't think that they are really relevant to the main currents of minorities. And in this case, we think that if you are a LGBTQ leader trying to go for and advocate for the LGBTQ plus movements in those non-Western countries, we think that your job is to actually save the most amount of save and advocate for the most amount of people and represent the most amount of people within the status quo, right? Rather than just going for these kind of focusing on minorities, we think that your job is to rather focus on majority minorities, right? We think that is the duty and the job of a LGBTQ plus leader, and that is the reason why we don't think that their case actually stands or are mutually exclusive at the end of the day. Now moving on to two other substances. First of all, I'm going to talk to you about why are Western terms better, and secondly, I'm going to analyze the stakeholders within today's debate, which are first of all the communities, secondly the advocates or the LGBTQ leaders within those non-Western countries, and thirdly, how are foreign helps or foreigners going to help more in promoting these kind of LGBTQ plus movements. First of all, why are Western terms better? When we talk about terminologies that address the issue of LGBTQ plus movements or any other things, we think that terminologies are important when they most accurately describe the problems in an exact way, right? For instance, when we talk about terminologies in US terminologies like business laws or economic laws, and compare it with laws like economic and business laws of other East Asian countries or non-Western countries, we think that they have different nuances and whatnot, right? However, in this case, when Western countries and non-Western countries share the same agenda or whatnot, we think that is the moment where we would rather stick with Western ideologies, because these local historical terms are rather focusing on not on the LGBTQ plus movements, but rather on these kind of minorities, which we think are not really the focal point, that these LGBTQ plus leaders would really want to focus into this debate, right? Then the major question becomes: do they really share the same ideas, or do these people in Western countries and non-Western countries share the same ideologies, right? We say yes, right? Because we think the Western ideas about masculinity or femininity will not really differ from non-Western countries, right? Because we think that in Western countries, when we talk about masculinity, so men are more likely to work better in physical labors. We don't think that this is largely different from non-Western countries, because we say that Western ideologies about masculinity or femininity or about these LGBTQ plus movements are usually based on a common background that all human beings or also societal members share in today's debate, right? So because of this, we don't think that Western people and non-Western people actually do not. We don't think that they share different ideologies about LGBTQ plus movements, and that is why we say Western terms depict LGBTQ plus movements better in dealing with LGBTQ activities. Secondly, let's go on to stakeholder analysis, right? We say that first of all, how is this going to change the community, right? We say that the community members themselves are more likely to look up to these Western ideologies or Western activists, right? Because there are success cases in those Western countries, right? We say that queer parades or LGBTQ plus movements or other social movements that have been successful in Western countries, that is the exact case that these non-Western countries do actually want to follow by following suit with by using the exact same terminologies that these Western countries are using within the status quo, right? We don't think that any harms will actually go on to the community members when we start using these LGBTQ plus terminologies. Secondly, why will these advocates or these LGBTQ leaders themselves be more prone or have higher effectiveness at the end of the day, right? We say that these advocates or leaders themselves have been inspired from these Western ideologies or Western success cases from the very get-go, right? Exactly because why did LGBTQ Q plus movements have actually gained spotlights or gained attention from the beginning, right? We say that we say that these queer parades or social movements that advocate LGBTQ peace plus people in the West have been successful, and that is the core reason why these advocates or leaders themselves were inspired to actually learn more about LGBTQ plus movements and actually learn more about these terminologies and how they are going to be successful at the end of the day. And this is the reason why we say that the advocates or the leaders themselves will bring up more higher effectiveness when we effectively use these kind of LGBTQ plus terminologies. Thirdly, how will foreign help be better on our side of the house, right? When we talk about non-Western countries, especially in cases of authoritarian regimes, we say that in those cases, internal changes by their own powers might not be so effective at the end of the day, right? Because these authoritative regimes, if they are actually going against these kind of LGBTQ ideologies, they're more likely to use force and actually subjugate all of the ideologies coming from these internal social movements. In those cases, we say that it is better for these LGBTQ leaders to actually use these Western ideologies and gain attention from these other Western leaders so that they can actually bring about internal changes by collaborating with these Western forces. Because in today's day, we're not talking about like bringing changes to minorities, but rather focusing on LGBTQ plus movements in those non-Western countries. We think that it is highly effective and it is a duty for these LGBTQ plus leaders to actually use these terminologies, especially when dealing with these LGBTQ plus activities. And these are the reasons why we're very positive. Thank you.
Your opposition, Deputy Prime Minister.
What they miss from the opening opposition is a nuance coming from outside the house, is that once the Western movement become the Western driven and introduce the Western power and Western terminology, in this case, this is irreversibly lost the culture and the nuance of the local culture. We think this is particularly significant consequences because on the comparative, even if this is comparatively slightly less more difficult to include more people, more individual or more minority, still the sustainable development of these kind of social movement is particularly important. This is a clear contribution coming from opening comment. Two things in summation from the Deputy Prime Minister. Firstly, I am going to talk about the analysis of the Western terminology and the analysis of the social LGBTQ movement. And secondly, I am going to talk about local terminology, how this is effective in terms of using the local terminology. All the matter will be integrated. Firstly, in terms of Western terminology, we think that this is particularly, they mentioned that the Western terminology can represent the most amount of people. We think this is still have the Western bias, Western prejudice in terms of terminology, because this is based on the biological perspective and the individual perspective of the scientific idea of the Western concept. Because this is only about biology. But in the context of this kind of the local terminology, we think the local or cultural perspective or religious perspective is fully introduced and in terms of historical historically and culturally. We think this is quite different in terms of capturing the nuance in the first places. They mentioned that some terms can be captured and nuance. We agree with that. But we say that core nuance was some other nuance is lost. We think this is important because the entire nuance coming from the local terminology is fit to your this kind of tradition in the first places. We think this is massively important. That's why I say this kind of differentiation between the local terminology but exists, but still you are LGBT, you are gay, you are lesbian, even though you have the identity in terms of local terminology. We think this is massively significant situation. So what is happening after the local, the Western-driven using the Western-driven terminology? Because we think this kind of symbolic integration of Western terminology can be the branch, just the local social movement become the branch of Western movement in the first places. Because firstly, the academic theory of LGBTQ is mainly exists in the Western country, and we think this is why this kind of interpretation of the term and interpretation of the movement in and of itself is strongly influenced by the West. And as long as this kind of academic background in terms of LGBTQ do not exist in the Western, non-Western country, in this particular context, this is highly less likely to have the power, the local movement have the power to this kind of have the speaking in this kind of area. We think secondly, the power imbalance, particularly in the context of financial muscle, is a significant problem. Because simply the power of the Western, the financial power of the Western feminism, the Western social, the Western LGBTQIA movement is particularly significant rather than this kind of non-Western movement. We think this influence is simply the harmful in the first places. Once the West-driven happens, we think the next generation are grown in under the context of the LGBTQ terms or this kind of Western term. We think this kind of irreversibility is particularly significant because once they lost, the identity which fit the culture is lost entirely or forever. We think this is massively significant damaging in terms of culture of the local history of LGBT and local history of this kind of sexual minority in the local community.
Alright, so if those cultural minority has a dire necessity in sustaining its existence, they bluntly go to the LGBT movement as a branch. Why LGBT movement by itself and take an amicable step to those minorities?
I think this is a debate about this kind of will of the LGBTQ community, this kind of sexual minority community. In the first place, we think this is massively significant. Absorb the power and the nuance is particularly significant because cultural and religious identity is fundamentally important. And more than that, in terms of collaboration with the Western culture, do not integrate entirely. Because, for example, even though name and purpose is different, LGBT movement and feminist movement are actually integrated and collaboration. Because we think this kind of name, and even though this is some separation and semi-academic background is different, but still the collaboration in terms of financial level, in terms of the kind of theory level, we think this is important. But integration is particularly problematic. Some separation is still necessary to sustain the identity. We think this is massively significant connotation coming from outside the house. So let's talk about our argument about local terminology. We think the local terminology is particularly important because my partner already mentioned that the nuanced argumentation about this kind of, even though some nuance is similar, but some is not. Because we think that this kind of the nuance of the language is different from the country to country. Because this kind of environment or the culture or religious based, lots of influence exists, and this kind of the growth of the culture is based on the religion and culture and tradition. We think this is particularly important because if you understand yourself as this kind of local terminology, but you are imposed by the Western country, you are LGBT, you are gay, you are lesbian. In this situation, this kind of different feeling, a strange feeling exists. That's why you have the less motivation to collaborate with this kind of movement. We think that's why this kind of collaboration with entire local movement is particularly failing because you cannot understand you are gay, you are lesbian. We think this is massively problematic. Because you are local, you understand yourself as a local terminology. We think this is particularly important. And more than that, not only the nuance, but also the historical accumulation is also exists. For example, the Western part, this kind of word have the historical accumulation or historical nuance exists. Because, for example, the people living in western part of Japan are sometimes called naniwa because this kind of naniwa associates the history of the trader of the Japanese western part of the Japanese people. We think in this situation, not only this kind of term themselves, but also this kind of association is also happening in terms of the other kind of term. Like for example, naniwa bushi represents the other kind of the language of Japan, with language of western part of Japan. We think if you understand this just geographically, or this is only part of the western part of Japan, we think you cannot associate yourself as this kind of history of trader of Japanese western part of citizen. We think this kind of association is particularly important because this kind of identity, cultural unification or the community unification is only happens when you share the identity. We think this kind of sharing identity is exclusively happens in nuanced local term or historical term. We think that's why this is particularly important in terms of the increasing supporter and increasing the collaboration of the entire local community. That's why on the comparative, that even if some misrepresentation happens, still this is on balance, that they better to sustain the local identity. We think we are very proud to oppose.
There's a lot of things to say in this DLO speech, but nonetheless, I'd like to reinstate the context that came out from the leader of opposition from the get-go. We tell you that these minorities and these local historical terms that are extremely unique to these local communities often derive from the minority communities themselves. We tell you in the first place that they're oppressed and they have been continually oppressed for decades, often centuries, and historically as well. We tell you that they have made little to no progress, and the current regime itself has made little to no progress as well in representing them and having and taking their backs. Moreover, we tell you that's exactly the necessity as to why we need them. The further backing from the LGBTQ community, not only from the domestic countries, but also from foreigners. Moreover, we tell you that because of this unique type of oppression that has continuously happened with this country and the type of regimes pushing through new ideologies that constantly reject the type of minority ideologies in the first place, we tell you that dominant type of ideologies and that dominant ideas of gender and sexuality are more Western driven and actually don't comply with the type, and it makes it harder for people to sympathize with the types of things that are happening because they're being actively oppressed continuously. So therefore, we tell you when you want to use terminology to sympathize with the general public, you have to use terminology that they understand and terminology that they can agree with. We tell you when you use when the minorities themselves are being currently strongly oppressed, and their terminologies and their ideas of sexuality and gender themselves have not been bought by society itself. It becomes extremely hard for terminology to do what it's supposed to do. So on this, we have 3 points. First of all, which terminology is more accurate, which addresses more concerns. Second of all, which provides better representation to the people. And last of all, which is more strategic and leads to a more stronger LGBTQ movement. We think, and hopefully closing has nothing to do with that. Well, first of all, in terms of which is more accurate, we tell you that first of all, terminology's role, as I already told you, is to sympathize, is to garner a type of understanding for the type of motives, and motivations that you want to go through. And which can also lead on to the type of impact that they talk about agenda. But moreover, we tell you that in that case, it's extremely important for terminology to address the main concerns of the society. We agree that there are certain words that you can never replace in a certain language, but we think that it's never the case in that when those types of specific nuances can address the entire amount of concerns of the community itself. We tell you the trade-off here is that you're sacrificing strong terms that have global recognition, have academic backing, and things that have been already successful in the Western world and non-Western countries as well. And we tell you that once you sacrifice that to use select words and gain these select type of things that we think are not mutually exclusive in the first place, this is where you lose out and the type of advantage and the type of power that you can bring to the LGBT community. We already told you, to restate, the Ella already told you as to why the Western terminology itself is representative of these types of societies. First of all, we tell you that these regimes themselves are often Western-backed in the first place. So because they're Western-backed, they often reflect Western ideologies, and that often includes cultural ideologies such as gender and sexuality and whatnot. So we tell you that because these regimes have been actively pressing these ideologies, that is current dominant ideology. But moreover, we tell you that even if it's not the case that they're Western-backed regimes, which we think is the majority of the time anyways, but moreover, we tell you that nonetheless, they share the same common grounds and the same common ideas of what normal sex is, about what normal sexuality is, about what normal gender is, and what masculinity and femininity is. We tell you that no matter what opposition never succeeded in telling you, is that how these two things are completely different in these societies. We tell you that even in our worst case scenario, we have a type of commonality between this, and we think that commonality is quite large from the get-go. So we think that Western terminology in the first place addresses the types of concerns and is capable of accurately representing these people in the first place. So moving on to representation, can we still keep minority rights? They tell you that individual bias and not being concerned for the culture itself is something that's very harmful. We don't think that's necessarily harmful because when you keep individual rights, we tell you that nonetheless you're keeping the interest of the individual and you're still helping the individual out. So we don't think that necessarily we're providing anything negative in the first place. But moreover, we tell you that their type of keeping religion and cultural uniqueness in the status quo is something that's not mutually exclusive. We tell you it's better achieved on our side. But to slightly address it, we tell you that first of all, there's a type of intersectionality between gender, sexuality, and religion and culture as well. We tell you that succeeding in one type of intersectionality can very easily lead to being addressed in a religious culture or a religious dimension or cultural dimension. We don't think that's extremely exclusive. Moreover, we think that Western bias doesn't mean that when you have Western collaboration, that doesn't mean that Western collaboration is very oppressive of what you're trying to do. There's oftentimes little conditionality of their support. There's oftentimes very little conditionality, the type of financial aid that they often give these type of non-Western communities. And therefore, we tell you that you still have a lot of representation and of freedom to do whatever you want because these people often are very sympathetic of your plight. Moreover, we tell you that we better keep this minorities' rights because we, at the end of the day, provide a stronger movement, which leads on to the final clash in the opening house and why I think we clearly took this debate home. Because at the end of the day, when their main case, all by itself, was minority rights and how we can represent the minorities, we tell you that at the very end of the day, when we have a very oppressed LGBT community, when we have a very oppressed minority, and when the current assumption of this debate is that the LGBT community has to back the minorities in order for them to have representation in the first place, we tell you that what the House has to necessarily prove is who has the stronger LGBTQ community at the end of the day. They give you no mechanism at all as to how they intend to actually improve the LGBT community and make them stronger. We tell you that because this is a requisite for any type of rights to be represented, we tell you that we do that. First of all, we tell you that even if there's foreign aid on both sides, because Western countries and Western LGBTQ movements, no thank you, I'm not going to take it. Western LGBTQ movements, because they give out help very generously, we tell you on our side of the house, even if there's foreign aid on both sides, our side of the house brings you more foreign support, more foreign aid. Because now you use that language that they actually understand, things that they can better sympathize with, things that they know better about, and therefore have confidence in investing, or in other words, are more sympathetic and more eager to invest and donate as well, because they share common plights and concerns. Moreover, we tell you that the leaders themselves of LGBT communities are often highly Western influenced and have Western ideas. So in the very simple act of giving a speech or talking to these communities, we tell you that in that case, it's even easier for leaders to tell and rehearse what they learned in Western universities or whatnot to the type of LGBT community that they already know. But moreover, we tell you that the LGBT community itself wants their individual rights to be kept, want their individual concerns to be kept. And we think that actually this emphasis on individual rights is something that creates more people to join in the first place, because that's a very basic interest from the get-go. So we tell you that when, especially when you're using Western terminology, and you're following the type of more successful cases in the world, such as the United States, versus the European Union, for instance, this is when the community has more confidence and is more eager to back, and also to go public with their type of backing, even to extend to financial backing of what they want to achieve in the LGBT community. We think in opening house, this clearly goes to opposition. We have told you our representation is still kept on our side, is actually better kept on our side through a strong LGBT community, and how terminology itself is accurate enough to address all the types of concerns in these non-Western countries as well. We think clearly opening house goes to opposition. Thank you.
The opening government actually contextualized well about those kind of minorities who really want to prefer to be left alone or whatnot. And we believe we actually agree with those kind of status quo, but as the yellow pointed out, they did not explain why is it better to achieve alleviating the inequality inside of those kind of countries. So we'll be the one exclusively explaining why this kind of thing is better for those kind of alleviating and rectifying the inequality problems within non-Western societies. Before I move on to our team's constructive, few kind of responses to the LOs and DLO speeches. They firstly talked about the Western narratives are kind of better, and they are having the same goals. We have to use the Western terminology and the Western notions. We firstly say that we want to say that we actually concede to the fact that the Western terminology and Western those kind of notions evolve kind of better, and we also concede to the fact that the goals are kind of being the same. But at the same time, we want to say that because they are kind of having different contexts and different circumstances, we have to apply the different tactics and the different solutions are necessary in this kind of sense. And we also want to talk about that. Non-Western people are kind of intrinsically hostile to those kind of Western people. So actually receiving and perceiving the Western terminology and the Western notions completely won't be possible in the non-Western society. And finally, I will move on to our team's constructive. And before I move on, I want to clearly state that the historical terms are the kind of term that is related to the history of the whole countries, and the whole country's people are actually sharing the experiences of wars or something or whatnot. So actually, that is the terms that emphasize the fact that they have undergone some same kind of events, some kind of historical events. And we will now to move on to our team's construction. I would like to firstly talk about the characteristic of the public and the non-Western countries. Firstly, the public and the non-Western countries are actually intrinsically hostile toward the Western countries because of the long history of deprivation and exploitation, and they haven't eliminated the opportunities to get developed. So they are actually having a psychologically hostile and have an antagonism toward those kind of people, and tends to be hostile to everything comes from the Western society. So this kind of injecting this kind of notions, injecting this kind of notions into the non-Western countries will lead to the antagonism to the notion itself about the inequality. We have to alleviate inequality, and we have to rectify rectify the problems. This kind of notion itself would receive the antagonism from the non-Western public people. So it is not actually helpful to call for some kind of changes because, as I told you before, we have to concede to the fact that non-Western people, the LGBTs in those kind of countries are getting deprived of their rights. And secondly, about the activists in the non-Western countries, we believe that the public are very kind of having a less understanding toward the activists of the LGBTQ movement because they have lack of education and lack of knowledge, and they are actually busy for doing their own duties. So we believe, we believe that non-Western terminology is much more better in this kind of condition to actually call for the public to also change and agree for the activists to change because the activists can show if they have a non-Western terminology, they can show that they actually share some kind of same history, and they are likely to more emphasize toward those kind of terminology raised by the activists. And they can acknowledge that this kind of feminism or LGBTQ movements are not something suddenly advanced, but there is something affiliated with their kind of own history. So they will be more conceit and more emphasized to those kind of movements. My second argument is about the characteristic of the development. We want to say that if the characteristic of the development is like this, the characteristic of minority rights development is like this. If we want to alleviate the inequality, we have to first actually alleviate the living problems. If you want to alleviate those kind of problems, improving the life quality of the people is much more important because if they have deprived of their lives and they have a really kind of low life standing, they will be actually not interested in those kind of minority rights or something. So actually, Western feminism movement or Western LGBTQ movements have been evolved by improving their life quality first, and after that, people became interested in the minority rights. So this kind of phases have to be followed if we want to alleviate this kind of problems of inequality. So we believe that non-Western terminology is not really good because of first, injecting the only consequences and only consequences is only forcing the top-down changes and actually ignoring the phases. So we believe that it is better to leave out the non-Western terminology to evolve with the phases evolve with themselves, with the phases according to the development of equality movements. And secondly, we want to say that because the non-Western civilized and non-Western people are actually having a low standard of living. So actually, they are actually hard hard to choose the rights and hard to call for the rights. So in order for them to perceive this kind of problems, we have those kind of activists of LGBTQ movements have to cooperate with other kind of social movements, such as feminism movements or etc. So common sense of unity is kind of important in this sense. So we have to actually use this kind of historical terms, historical terms to actually share the common sense of unity, to actually to cooperate other social movements that can lead to those practical changes. And our last concept about the ethnofeminism, about the characteristic of equality movements. They as the opening government talked about, under the LO characterization, Western narratives toward inequality go more than the non-Western terminology. So if we inject those kind of Western narratives into the non-Western civilization, Western narratives will actually more dominate compared to the non-Western terminology. So these will actually have a lot of impacts, and we will exclusively provide you this kind of effects. Firstly, some of the exclusive problems happening in the non-Western world cannot be depicted because they are only using the Western terminology. So this kind of problems exclusively happen cannot be depicted well, then this is actually causing a problem. And secondly, we want to say that we want to actually have respect the diversity of narratives to call out for changes, because people have there are diversity of people and there are diversity of ideas. So if they have a uniform narrative, which is the Western terminology and the Western notions, it's not actually good for everyone to feel empathy towards this kind of inequality movements and all the LGBTQ movements. So therefore, I'm very proud to.
I have a lot of things to say, so I'll just go to my substantive. 2 points of extension. Firstly, why this strategy is against the core principle of LGBT movement. That essentially, when the LGBT movement is there to expand accepted characteristics of sexuality, when you go into local accepted sexuality, you are not essentially expanding accepted sexualities in that region. But also, essentially, when you bind those locally accepted sexualities with Western groups, you are essentially driving the battle of West and having these minorities into that battle that the West is having. You're essentially exploiting sexual minorities for the sake of other sexual minorities. And we think that the movement for the acceptance of their rights and freedom from fear cannot afford to do so. Secondly, my extension will be about why this strategy will be rejected by local society, why it causes backlash, why trying to analogize yourself with a praise group simply will not be accepted by the local people, and it's a terrible strategy. Before I go on with that, a couple of rebuttals. First, OG's idea is that you want to preserve local identities. One, if it's accepted in the local community, you do not need to advocate for that. It is tolerant in their own way and have their own characteristics. It might have despite nuances, but if they're okay with it, then you do, as the LGBT movement, you do not need to focus on them. And if they have a problem, as my partner pointed out, they will join in the label of LGBT movement. Because LGBT is not like a unified Western term, but it's a study that is focused on sexuality, where it goes into certain local communities and local groups and analyze how they can universalize understanding of sexuality is important for diverse cultures. And that is why a specific local community that is different franchise exists. It is willing to accept them and accept them in their own way, because diversity is at the core of the LGBT movement. But also, their substantive lacked a problem in the status quo, because they provide no analysis of why status quo's gradual change is insufficient. Closing was slightly better on that. They say that there's going to be hostile to West. The thing is that we understood why it's hostile to the West, but they never told us why it remains to be strong as a hostile movement. Because in the status quo, there's a rising youth that is tolerant to the LGBT identity. There's social pressure, international pressure that's creating international legal frameworks to be created. For example, it's okay for Malaysia to go on with Malaysian people to go on to gay pride parade, or for example, the misogynist society and an LGBT exclusive society like India has a Supreme Court decision that accepts LGBT rights for sex and equality of marriage. These all prove that there's gradual change. We can see that there's hostile movement that is decreasing, and we do not understand why this gradual change in the status quo is insufficient on their side of the house, why there's no problem coming from OG and CG taken down. The last idea coming from TG is that you want cooperation from some movements. The problem is that if these groups are suffering together, that's how they can cooperate. That's why if they have this common goal, feminist movements, LGBT movements would naturally cooperate. But if they're talking about trying to have local accepted groups to join in because of this policy, these local accepted groups have no reason to risk their own movement by having LGBT movements coming in. Because essentially, if they're suffering together, you do not have to change your terminology to local because you're suffering together. The only reason movements that you can have on their side of the house is locally accepted group. But they don't want to take the risk, so they're not going to have. It's rather you lose as a movement, because if you abandon Western terminology, if you abandon people who don't want to have the local identity, but rather want a universal identity like LGBT, these two movements will leave, or Western connections you will lose. So your capacity to have strong connections and support from Western institutions of society will be lost, and we think that's far more important and relevant to the LGBT movement because of the history and success. We think that it's far lost on this side of the house. Sure.
Okay, you can't just assert that LGBTQ is a universal concept without responding to analysis that they are power-based and individualistic, whereas locals ones are different.
So I'm saying that if it's accepted, we don't need to focus it. If it's not accepted, we need to expand it, and that's what a new external term like LGBT is most relevant for. So extension on the strategy. At its core, the LGBT movement exists for the freedom from fear based on your identity. It is an advocacy for people who have certain sexuality to pursue their liberty in contexts where sexuality has been socially and legally shamed or prohibited. That's why it's important that how people define their sexuality, it might be diverse, it might be say side B Christians, it might be a masculine gay person, but whatever they want to be able to be free from that pressure or persecution. That means that at its core, it's important that, and because it wants has a majority to be accepted, at its core it's about you being appreciated by an ordinary person, but also it's at its core about expanding the tolerant identity because we don't know what people would prefer to be their best identified characteristic. But also it's important because it's for everyone in that relevant suffering that you do not distort currently tolerated groups to be able to sustain and enjoy the current liberty in that relevant context. Why is this strategy going to distort those fundamental purposes of the LGBT movement? Because unfortunately, local terminologies like hijra or the Churchian or the countless examples that were shown on the info slide is not just a sexual minority, but mainly a certain ethnicity, a certain religion, a certain local culture that has a partial characteristic of being sexuality. They are a special group, often living in rural areas, and it's not necessarily representative of just a sexual minority with, just an urban life or sort of maybe masculine or like swimming, or I don't know, certain characteristic, which is just bound to the sexuality. Thank you. Which means that when you focus on those local terminologies and use them, you essentially are never able to achieve the status of being an ordinary person. You are trying to analogize yourself with a special, unique group in that culture. But also, the fact that you trying to analogize yourself with a local terminology means that you have stereotyping of that culture, of that tradition, of that religion to common people of LGBT groups. You're taking them as a movement that we are the same as those people, essentially saying that the LGBT movement making people on the ground, LGBT people, suffer from stereotyping that they're going to be from the same minority group, which not necessarily people don't associate with. The worst case scenario is that often local terms have despicable nuances in the LGBT people, like Okama in Japan, or certain minorities in the areas might have despicable, discriminated groups and are sort of with a sexual identity, which means that we're trying to analogize that. You accelerate persecution of that group. It empowers movement that it's okay for common people to bash these people because that's how the terminology is used, and that means that you do not expand the tolerance in the movement after all. But also, the local movement, local people have their own life. But they're going to be bound by the West. Because even if you change the terminology, it's the Western movement. You're going to be together, which means that you're imposing Western taste to locally accepted people, or you might risk radicals attacking these local groups because they're going on with the band of the West. You're risking the lives of local people who are okay with their sexuality, tolerating their own nuances, but also depriving the capacity of other people who are not fit with the local culture to be able to tolerate of their new identities, and we're proudly of those.
And now invite government to May I start? Madam Speaker, when the day comes when all LGBT communities enjoy the same rights and equality as all of us in this room, I think the textbooks regarding how each LGBT communities in different areas of this world will be written very differently from each other. And that is exactly the reason why we, the government, refuse the whole opposition narrative where they tell us that a goal that is equal in a vacuum can also be applied into different circumstances and different cultures in this world. We believe that that is wrong, and we have to be realistic. And sure, it may be the same goal as a movement in a vacuum space, but when we apply it in these other nations and these local communities, it has to change, it has to adapt to its community and its uniqueness. And that is the stance we stand by. And before I move on to summarize the whole debate for you, I'd like to bring you few rebuttals regarding the closing opposition. So they talk about the distorting of current movement, and they tell us that in status quo it is evolving and it is good enough. But what we want to first tell you is that compared to the Western communities and nations, we clearly see that the movements and the rights of LGBTQ in this non-Western world are more or less compared to the Western ones. And we believe that there's a net benefit when it comes to actually accelerating the change and bringing the change faster and better for these individuals. And that is what we are trying to do on our case. But then let's move on to their extensions. They tell us that because these local communities have other characteristics that represent them other than their sexual orientation, can actually harm the movement. But what we tell you is that there is a general lack of education in these nations regarding the sex, regarding different kinds of sexual orientation as gay or lesbian or whatnot. And we believe that when the education regarding the sex is actually underrepresented in a curricular, it is much easier for the nation to approach this matter from a social view where they say these are the communities that exist in our local towns and local areas, and while they have these other characteristics, some of it is actually sexual orientation as well. We believe that this is a way where the some kind of hostile sex orientation idea can be better normalized for this hostile local public and tell them that these communities exist and they're unique, and one of their uniqueness includes their sexual orientation. We believe that this is a much better narrative to actually convince the public to join the movement and actually participate in bringing tangible changes. Now I'll move on to my summary. Today's debate has been summarized to two goals. How do we better change the public and help the advancement of these local communities? And how does this motion affect the movement in a global level? First, about the general public. The member of the government provided you several contextualization regarding what kind of public these minorities and these communities have to face in non-Western nations. She told you that they are more conservative compared to the Western world, and they are often hostile to Western ideology or Western concepts because of the historical reasons. For example, when India has been invaded by England, and they are not very friendly nations, even in status quo. And we believe that actually bringing an external narrative that they may have been historically very hostile to is very bad for these communities, because now they are being framed as a Western thing, Western movement, and we believe that that is something that the local communities would want to reject. But they tell us that by using this Western terminology, they can bring more media attention, they can bring more funding. Firstly, they don't really explain to us how this is going to happen, and with the lack of the mechanism, we find this very not probable, because we don't really see how this is going to be profitable for these firms that's going to fund this movement. Well, let's talk about the movement itself actually helping and funding with good intention. We told you that we believe that such action actually leads to a uniform narrative within the movement, which is harmful. My partner explicitly told you that we want diversity in this movement's narrative, because when the diversity of narrative exists, more people are able to join and empathize and relate with the movement. But when the only major and uniform narrative of this movement is the Western one, we find it very difficult that non-Western non-Western LGBTQ communities who suffer differently, who face different problems in daily life, is able to empathize with this movement and actually join the participation. Thus, we believe that it's harmful and actually makes less likely for more people to join the movement in these local communities in these non-Western countries. But then let's talk more about the change in the public. We also told you that yes, our government has told you how the nuances of the language and how that's unique. And my partner has characterized this for you and said that this local community's history is part of the bigger history of this whole country. And that means that we believe that this cultural terminology will be able to be closely related and associated with the big historical events and explain to the public how they did not suffer so differently from these events or even suffered greater than the public because of their sexual orientation or whatnot. And we believe that such characterization and such narrative that can actually bring more empathy from the general public and actually encourage them to support this motion more. Yes.
Alright, on one hand, the entire government narrative says that the words had some nuances and some distortions. On the other hand, the people would suddenly see LGBTQ movement and those cultural entities as identical. Which is the main scenario from your side of the house?
Well, I believe that the goal, or whether this person is gay or lesbian, isn't really what this terminology is trying to do. I believe that the use of the terminology should be defined by what kind of practice it's trying to help. Because when in China, these LGBTQ communities are prosecuted just for being LGBTQ, we believe that different terminologies, different narrative, different tactics is needed, as the member of the government told you. And when different tactics are needed, we believe that such Western, already evolved terminology is never enough, because they're too evolved or too different to actually well represent and well solve and well support the tactics that these local communities want to use to improve their own daily lives. And we believe that that's why the difference between Western terminology and this local historical terminology difference is crucial, and the impact was only uniquely brought by the closing government in today's debate. Thus, I believe that it's the closing government who told you the specific and unique characterization of the public in these non-Western nations, and how such uniqueness and characteristic of the public actually affect what kind of practice and what kind of narrative and terminologies these communities use. And also told you what kind of hurtful impact it can have on the whole movement as a global stage, where it harms the diversity of its full narrative. Thus, I'm proud to propose.
Speaker, the narrative for the movement is about for the progress of the right to cater to the benefit to the people on the ground. This is the reason why we need to analyze and what will be the counterfactual, like if we implement this particular strategy taken by LGBTQ plus movement. In that sense, the extension from closing government is particularly important because we are the one and who actually see the closest eyes and to the ground as in what will happen and what kind of the possible reaction that we expect. And we are the one who talk to you how this policy will create the suboptimal consequences, not only for the LGBTQ movement, but also for those cultural minorities, according to the side of opening government. This is the reason why those contributions should never be regretted, and this is the reason why we are very proud to oppose. Mainly two things provided by opposition with. Firstly, I can analyze what actually the LGBTQ movement should be. This is one of the main contention from closing government. And opening government and closing government just believes and more blanket without identity. It's somehow better, not really explaining us why. And secondly, I can examine which scenario would be beneficial or harmful with regards to the existence of the problems or a public reaction to this particular strategies. All rebuttal is going to be integrated, so directly for the first issue, ideal. Ladies and gentlemen, although there are some abstract discussion happening in the opening half, let's say like a representation or the common ground, and that can be applied to any movement, by the way, but it was quite absent until closing opposition came. In the respect of what LGBTQ movement is about and why we need to stick the particular terminology. Chikara particularly told to you that LGBTQ movement, the goal of that is that the freedom from disadvantage, regardless of the cultural or historical background that you have. And to make this policy, to make this goal achieved, and we need some flagship term, and that can be applied in local, into the local discretions. So in the LGBTQ movement, that word in particular, and has some, let's say, ambiguity, or let's say how to call that? Yeah, ambiguity or a possibility of the interpretation that can be applied to the local discretions. And this is particularly important because, no thank you, regardless of the culture or where you live, and marriage, jobs, friendship, kinship, or whatnot are the very important issues for you. And moreover, and most of the guys are actually not really deeply culturally affiliated in the first place. If you're from Beijing in the city, you're not necessarily affiliated to this particular cultural terminology presented by the entire government side. So to cover and to cater to the benefit of more and more people with the purity of the issue of sexuality, and that particular word is the very thing that the LGBTQ movement stick to. And this is the nuance and uniquely provided by the side of closing government, not really responded by the closing government. And it's particularly important in this debate. It's because the movement exists to the cater to the benefit to the people on the ground. And to make it happen, and we need to decide, no thank you, what kind of prioritization is ideal according to the characteristic of movement. So on the principle level, closing the opposition, put the period as in how actually the LGBT movement should be in dealing with those cultural minority necessarily existing in some regions. That's why those the ideal point, or how actually the LGBT movement should do, that a clash falls to the entire opposition. There you go.
Okay, what you are talking is about Western with LGBT movement philosophy. Why non-Western movement should adopt the same philosophy of Western?
Ladies and gentlemen, what we need to recognize here is that the LGBTQ movement, it happened in the West, but it's true. However, it does not necessarily mean, it necessarily entails the power structure or whatnot. This is the reason why, no thank you, in most of the non-Western countries, it's on the rise of the acceptance to the LGBTQ movement, and closing government pointed out in the case of India, Taiwan, or even Japan has some partnership law in the municipal government level, or we need to recognize the existence of the Rainbow Parade in Korea, Japan, China. Given those the rise of the movement, it does not necessarily mean those hostility or Western origin of the idea are mutually incompatible in both scenarios at the end of the day. And since the government was quite absent in fulfilling the existence of the mutual exclusivity in between the LGBTQ and acceptance of it, unlike a locally, culturally affiliated term and accepted of, we do not necessarily think those claims isn't powerful enough to make the win to the side of government. So, back to the second clash about, let's say, what kind of counterfactual we would see and whether it's beneficial or harmful at the end of the day. So, OG and CG and took the different strategies, so I'm dealing with it respectively. Firstly, OG told us the cultural minorities are discriminated nowadays, that's why we need to cater some benefit to them. Firstly, empirically unbelievable. As OG told to you, a different term represent different nuances, has different existence. And the closing opposition already pointed out that because of those cultural affiliations, let's say Hijra in India, and got the respective status, and compared to the a normal LGBTQ movement people, and actually Chikara told us Okama, and has some distinct recognition compared to the general movement of LGBTQ+. So because it's culturally affiliated, no thank you, and we do not necessarily believe that it leads to the utter discrimination, because they recognize the position, hence they know the term to be called. And more importantly, closing the opposition specifically told to you, if that's the problem, there will be the alternative for those minority movements to join the tide of the LGBTQ movement. No particular answer from the DPM. No, thank you. Hence, we didn't see the particular necessity for LGBTQ movement to compromise identity for some good at the end of the day. Let's take a look at the closings about the hostilities. We told you on the first level it's empirically unpersuasive. We told you various examples, even in the Asian context, no strong reputation so far. And historical a recognition or whatnot is the very response from them. But Chikara already preempted the existence of the intergenerational change, foretold us, and with the influx of the other cultures and the tide of the youth and with the internet culture, we do not necessarily see those, like a generational culture is like a long-standing and strong enough. And given the empirical unpervasiveness, we can simply dismiss those claims. And closing off, specifically told to you, why actually, given the situation, we recognize the nuance and the difference of those terms and the LGBTQ+, and careless analogization, rather and create a hostile environment on the very ground at the end of the day. And from those local movements, and you've been seeing some sly guy and who just put the facade, and which would be appreciated by the general public from the LGBTQ movement, and it will be seen as a huge betrayal because they slash the important identity for the move and just for the random benefit. This is the reason why we told us this policy will lead to suboptimal consequences and unjustifiable given the principle more than prior to oppose.